Well, I'm in the Travis Gafford Industry Studio right now during off-season, joined right now by Parth from TSM, as well as a dog in the background who might whine. What's the story with the dog?
He's my dog.
Okay.
You live really far away, and it's really demanding to get an interview with the famous Travis Gafford.
Ah,
so
yes.
I must bring my child with me.
Yes, I understand. Does the dog have a name?
The dog's name is Dunphy.
Okay.
He has been featured in Legends a couple of times, so you can go check out those episodes.
Very good. Nice plug at the start before we've even gotten into anything. Anyway, so let's talk a little bit about TSM's off-season. A lot of exciting news. So you guys have officially announced the roster. For those who haven't seen the announcement, do you want to run down the top to bottom?
Sure. So in the top lane we have Broken Blade, jungle we have Dardoch, mid lane we have Bjergsen, AD carry Kobe, and support is Biofrost.
All right. So how did all this come together? And I think I want to start first off with Biofrost because you brought Bio back, and I'm kind of curious how that whole thing went down.
Sure. So when we're building a roster, you kind of look at the entire roster as a cohesive piece. We were kind of looking at what we wanted to address in the last 2 years, and we recognized that most.
I love that he was completely calm while we were setting up, and now just very upset.
It's okay. He'll be fine. When building the roster, you usually kind of look at a roster as a cohesive piece that works together, right? In the last few years, we didn't really have a strong voice in the jungle position, and that's something that we wanted to fill. And that really comes from experience. So there were a lot of iterations of where we could go, right? We could look at North American jungler and import AD and import jungler and North American AD. So we kind of had a long process going into what we wanted to do. If we wanted to do North American jungler, honestly, we didn't think that Svenskeren would be an available piece because I think after being an MVP and doing really well, I thought it'd be crazy for him to move teams. So we were primarily looking at someone like Dardoch. We started talking to him super early on in the process, and then we realized that he was probably probably the most likely piece that we were going to go into our offseason with. And I know they had worked together in Echo Fox. We kind of spoke back and forth about what their working relationship would be like. And we felt that in terms of team dynamic, it would be better to have someone like Biofrost just to complement someone like Dardoch and Bjergsen on the team. So we started our initial conversations with CLG, and they were conversely kind of interested in the opposite. They wanted someone who was a stronger leader, help the team with structure and all of that stuff. So it just seemed like a good fit for both parties. So that's how the Biofrost thing came about.
After asking about Biofrost, I also want to ask you about Dardoch. So Dardoch, controversial pickup, and a lot of people are curious to see if he's going to succeed on this roster. Do you have, what kind of support systems are you putting in place to work with a player like Dardoch, and kind of what's your thought process bringing him in?
Sure. So TSM has had we've been talking to Dardoch or talking about Dardoch for a long time. If you saw the announcement video, he actually tried out for us in 2016. And at that time, we still had Svenskeren, and we decided to not go with him just because we think he's a really good player. I think no one disputes that. We just didn't think that the potential risk at the time was worth since we had Dennis. I think last year we also talked about him seriously, but at the time I think Tony was someone who kind of said that this is not somewhat a type of player that is easy to work with, and so we kind of shied away from that. And also at end of last year, we didn't have a sports psychologist working with us, so there were just a lot of risk from the staff side and even the player set that it wouldn't have been a good fit for our, atmosphere or culture. This year, however, we kind of went into the off season with the expectation that this is a very plausible pickup for us. So we kind of tweaked both our roster and our staff kind of to make sure that this is would be a good fit. So I know Peter Zhang, who's he worked with us for last year. I think he's a really strong coach in terms of working with him. He worked with Dardoch at TLA, and they have a pretty solid relationship of mutual respect. Dardoch and Bjergsen also met a few times during this offseason, and they kind of talked about what his journey has been like, and then Bjergsen kind of shared his journey, and then they're kind of aligned in terms of how they want to work together. And then we also have David Denis, our sports psych, who talked to Josh a few times. We understand what he brings to the team is a lot of passion and a lot of hard work and insane play, but there's also downsides in terms of like how he can affect the team atmosphere and all that stuff. Just talking to him this offseason, it's clear that he's matured a lot since he started out in TL and when he was like 17 or 18. I think he's like 20 or 21 now. He's really experienced in terms of how to work with teams, a lot of different players, and he has a more holistic approach of what it means to be a pro. And you can even kind of tell that when you look at like the eyes on Dardoch from like a year and a half ago. So I do think that as a player, he has developed a lot, and I do think that he is worth like a second shot on.
And so then how did Kabe come about?
So, I mean, again, we were looking at different iterations. So if we held our scouting grounds this year, I can kind of announce some of the people who are there. We actually had both of our supports there, Treats and Smoothie, and we were actually trying to see all the players available in North America that we could fit in there, because it is possible that the roster took like a different direction, right? So we had Tactical and Johnson, both of our 80 carries there, just kind of see like after a year what their experience level is like. Is it something that we want to move forward with? We actually had a few other 80 carries there as well. So we kind of did like our due diligence to see if they would be at a level that we needed next year if we wanted to head in a different direction. But we felt that they still lacked a little bit of an experience. They still needed like a year or so more before they could kind of join and compete with players like Double Lived, Cody Sun, etc. So that's why I think we kind of looked abroad. Obviously, there were a lot of free agents available. There were like Upset, Kobe, a lot of Korean players who were kind of being shuffled around. And I think Kobe seemed like a really good fit, both in terms of the experience he has, his temperament, and he's like worked with multiple rosters and like a lot of iterations. So he, as a player, seemed really adaptable and also really, really skilled. So I think Kobe overall, after looking at all the iterations that we could have fit together, Kobe was the best option.
And I interviewed him at Worlds, and I thought it was Kabe, but it's Kobe.
Well, I mean, I could be wrong.
Okay, well, we'll find out soon.
One of us is wrong.
Either way, so he just ended up feeling like the right fit, and so now, and then you guys obviously are you re-signed Bjergsen, and then Broken Blade. What was the decision? Was there ever any consideration on swapping out either of those players, or was it really like you were just looking at those three positions?
So primarily we were looking at those three positions. Obviously we would look at, like TSM philosophically would look at upgrades whenever possible for every role, but for those two roles specifically, we didn't think that there would be any massive upgrades to kind of warrant us swapping the players out. I know even Broken Blade, he got a lot of criticism in summer, but our team wasn't functioning super well. And we think that when we brought him on, right, generally when TSM adopts top laners, they kind of invest in them for like a long term. Same, like Darius was there for like 2 or 3 years, same with Hanser. And Broken Blade, when we brought him on, we did our like due diligence in terms of working with him. And we knew like the first year, like he was coming into like a major league, things were gonna be shaky. He's shown a lot of strengths. And I think he just needs some work to kind of get better. And so we're like willing to commit to him and see how things go in the next year or so.
All right. So then on the other hand, you decided to make a coaching staff change. You've not mentioned yet what the coaching staff will look like this coming year. And I know talking to you ahead of this, you're not going to do it in this interview, but I'd love to get some insight into the philosophy that you were approaching the coaching situation with.
Sure. So overall, so when we picked up Tony last year, it was kind of a departure from Song. What we wanted to do with Tony was kind of build like a strong foundation that would last us a long time, right? So the way that works is you bring on a coach that you kind of philosophically agree with how things should work, and then you kind of build on his strengths, because no coach in the scene has like the full skill set of what it takes to run like an esports team, right? So we brought on Tony. We tried to complement him by bringing on Peter, who was really good at working with rookie talent. We brought on our sports psych, and we kind of had like that system going. I think towards the summer, I think he said this too in the 100 Thieves interview. Philosophically, we had like over time we discovered that we had like differences in terms of what kind of players he wants to work with and how he wants to approach working with players that are having problems, how to deal with stress and all of this stuff. And so when I went through some of the roster iterations with him, I didn't think that like the pairing of the roster and the coach would be like necessarily as great. So at that time I said, we're not sure where we're gonna go in terms of direction yet. So if you want to explore other opportunities, then I think it's like a fair play for you. That's where like he got in touch with 100 Thieves, and they kind of ended up finding like a good fit there. So I said that if you really think that this is like a better fit for you, then you can kind of move in that direction.
So now that as you move into the next season, what are you looking, or how are you looking to approach the coaching staff?
So we haven't announced it yet. I know that the coaching staff we put together will be specifically built to cater to this roster. So we won't, over the last 2 years, obviously we've signed like big names like Song and Tony. And we were kind of, I think it makes sense for our direction to move in a position where we can help best support our players with the coaching staff that we can have for the next 2 years, rather than look for another like crazy big name. So I guess that's all I'll say for now.
Gotcha. Maybe you can speak specifically or even generally about how TSM approaches the offseason and as an org, what that looks like. Because I think a lot of people are wondering how much of this is you, how much of this is Reggie, how much of it is even Bjerg having a say in it. How does that kind of look like from the internal side?
Sure. So, I mean, most of the stakeholders on the team and org have a say in terms of how we're running things. We basically start off at like a foundation. So we already know like what pieces we're definitely looking to keep, both on the coaching side and the player side, and then we kind of decide what the short-term and the long-term plan looks like. So, for example, in 2018, the end of 2018, we were kind of deciding in terms of short versus long-term of Hanser versus someone like Broken Blade, right? And initially, we wanted to create a situation where we knew Hanser was more experienced and more ready at the time, but we wanted to bring on Broken Blade and kind of develop him. But neither player was really willing to share time. So we kind of had to basically make a judgment call on whether we just bring on someone new and like help train him up and take a risk on that, or we kind of keep Hanser and kind of move like the roster in that direction. So we would look at like, okay, forecasting a year from now, what's the projected market going to look like? What kind of people will be available? What kind of tweaks can we make in the long and short term? So there's basically usually a short-term plan in terms of what we want in terms of what we're aiming for this year based on the pieces we have, and then a long-term plan in terms of here's the like development pieces that we have for our staff and players and how we want to go from there.
What do you think of the conversation right now around imports versus local talent and the decisions that teams make around that?
I do think that certain teams have made really poor decisions around importing versus developing talent, because if you want to import, you're basically saying that this player is worth more than any person that can get here, because he's like the best value for that spot, and we're gonna find like other players in other spots to fill in the gaps, right? I think there's at least 2 teams who've done like a really poor job in like using import, and I think that part is really bad, because there are definitely slots where I think North American players can fit into our current teams. I think players like Pole Belter, Tactical, both new and old, right? There are slots where they would do a lot better job than the other players that have been picked up. That being said, I do think that the current level of talent at where it's at isn't justifiable to where you can be like, you should build an all-NA team and expect to win LCS or win Worlds. So it just depends on what your goals are.
Right. So it sounds like you feel like imports are necessary to at least domestic and international success.
Yeah. A team of domestic players is not going to beat the current TL.
Do you think this TSM lineup can beat the current TL?
It's a really hard question. I mean, I can answer completely honestly. We have players with enough talent that we can beat the current TL, but it's going to be a challenge to see if they can synergize and work well enough together in order to do so.
Right. Going back to this conversation about importing, players from other regions, there's also a lot of conversation around what orgs are doing to help develop talent. So are orgs investing enough into academy? Are they doing enough to scout talent in different areas? And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Sure. So I obviously don't know too much in detail about what other orgs do. I can just kind of give you our perspective of what we've done in the last, I guess, year and a half. So TSM holds our own scouting grounds every year. We invite players from NA, Europe, and everywhere else that we can see that we can have talent that conceivably fits into our academy or LCS system in some way. And every year our scouting grounds is different. So last year specifically, we wanted to see last year was the first year we did it. We wanted to see what talent is available. We invited a lot of players from both EU and NA. The problem was last year we did it after free agency, so there were a lot of players who weren't available to come out. So that's why we changed it this year. So Treats was one of the players that we brought him out last year. We also had Neon, who was an AD carry, I think, who ended up winning EU Masters, one of the splits this year. And then we had a couple of NA talent. Some of them were too young to even compete. So we have one guy called Sword. Basically, our deal with him is he streams under us. He's still going to high school. We basically invite him out to our house anytime he has free time, so he can spend time with the academy team and LCS team, in hopes that we develop him, and then eventually he'll join us when he's ready, right? So last year was the first year we kind of did it. We specifically picked Treats because we wanted to pair him with Tactical, who was a rookie. So I know a lot of people say you're not scouting any talent. You should have a roster in academy to have all NA players that you want to develop, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the best way of doing it. I think you still want a team that complements each other. So for example, last year we had Brandon, who was kind of a veteran. We had Spica, who was a rookie. Nick, who was kind of a middling. He was there for a year. Tactical was a complete rookie, and then Treats, who I think he has a veteran mentality, but still a rookie. That's a comprehensive piece where the rookies can kind of learn from the veterans, and each piece has a slot in where they can kind of go. You can see that they can eventually move up into the ladder. So that's kind of the philosophy that we have. The other thing to also take into consideration for academy is academy team is a practice ground for your LCS team. So going into spring finals last year, there was no fourth place match. So all the practice that you got was only with your academy team. So part of the advantage that we had compared to TL, for example, is our academy team was really cohesive. They'd won that year, and that was actually really good practice for us for that week. So you also want to make sure that, say, Broken Blade wants a really good practice partner to train against. It makes more sense for us to have more of a veteran presence on the academy team so that he can practice against. So I think the question isn't really black and white, where how do you develop your academy team or how do you build players out, is you just pick up as many rookies and try to develop them as possible, because academy system and what you need from an org varies a lot. So I can see a lot of different perspectives of why teams are doing certain things.
Gotcha. So it sounds like it's a little bit more complicated than just, why aren't you developing talent? Sometimes it's also about supporting the LCS team and that kind of thing.
Yeah. One thing I will say is that we were actually looking to have a third team, an online or trainee team. So Johnson, Sword, and Sarcasm, 3 players that we kind of picked up. All 3 of them didn't know what they wanted to do with League, right? They didn't know, Johnson was still going to college, and last year he didn't even know if he wanted to be a professional player. Sarcasm was attending, I think, UT Austin, and he was also I can kind of do this on the side. So we wanted to provide a place for these players to see if professional play is something that they can do. So we had an online team. They scrimmed maybe once or a couple of times of week, maybe a month, depending on what was available for them. And so one thing I think that a lot of teams can do, or the ecosystem can support, is helping players, the fringe cases that are either going to college or finishing high school, giving them a bigger path to pro than currently exists. And I know Derek Dennis from Ride has been working really hard towards this, and the amateur circuit this year that fed into Scouting Grounds was an attempt. But obviously, I think that ended up not panning out as well because all the experienced player who played in that circuit ended up going. And then I think the intention was good, just the outcome was really bad.
Yeah.
But I do think that the more pathways that players in North America have to recognize, oh, this is what I need to do in order to become a pro, and then have like amateur circuits that they can compete in, I think it's going to be stronger for the region moving forward.
I also want to ask you what you think of the competitive ruling that came out around Cloud9 during this break, I guess maybe like about a week ago or so. Mm-hmm. So supposedly the highest fine amount, especially if you take into account the equity they'll have to pay out in League of Legends esports history. What is your whole take on that situation and the ruling and everything that went along with it? It's
very nuanced, obviously. So since we're talking about equity, I can kind of touch on the Bjergsen piece with TSM. Bjergsen's been with TSM for a long time, and equity is something that like we wanted to kind of grant him, but obviously he wasn't in the rule set. So going into this next, like his contract was running out, so going into the next season, we wanted to kind of create like a compensation package that like helped him both financially and security-wise, because he was also like he's also been a player who's always been committed to TSM, and we're really committed to him. So we started conversations with Riot late last year, early this year about how this piece would be possible. We understand that there's a lot of ethical issues in terms of player equity if they're ever going to move, and just the idea of granting players equity, like players sometimes don't understand like what that entails, and so if Riot were to ever set a precedent that this was going to happen, they wanted to make sure that they did their due diligence in a way that the players would always be on like the winning side, because the org generally has a lot of control over this kind of stuff. So basically after a lot of going back and forth throughout the year, Riot came up with like a rule set that I think really made sense. So first, basically the intent was if a player has really been attached to an organization for a really long time and wants to either continue his career there and retire there, then they should be able to participate in the upside of when a company's valuation gets higher. So that's why like the first part is if you bet, you have to be with like a team for a certain period of time to show that you are going to be attached to the same team for a long time. So that's number one. Number two is equity is like a very different, nuanced piece in terms of helping understand compensation and everything. So Riot requires every player who's going to go through this process to get a completely independent lawyer that works closely with the player and their family to like help them understand what it's like, and then work both with the Riot and the team to kind of explain and go through this process with them. So even after we were like given permission to do this, we had like a long process with the lawyer to like kind of go back and forth on what this means and how the process would work. And the third important piece was Riot wanted to make sure that the players, if they were to ever leave a team for whatever reason, they could kind of divest their shares in like a timely manner, because off season is usually like a really crazy time and it doesn't leave enough time for players to like negotiate and go back and forth, right? And so if equity is like tying a player to a team, then it's going to be hard for them to transfer over, and Riot didn't want that to be like a reason. So there's like a process in place that if a player ever wants to, like if like the player who has equity ever wants to leave, then it can be like really like, there's a process that can make sure that it's like easily divestible. So it's never like a limiting factor in where a player can go. And obviously they should be like compensated and paid out and all that stuff by the company that's done that. So those are like the three major markers that kind of allow players now with the current process in place to get granted the equity, right? Whenever it comes to the actual competitive ruling, what's your take on all that? Sure. So I think in terms of the ruling and the fine itself, I know a lot of people are saying it's like really big, really egregious. I don't even think that it's that bad compared to like how much the assets are worth that were provided equity, and especially some of the buyouts you've heard in the offseason. So I'm not really sure that the fine is really that big, especially since say this is like one of the worst things you can potentially do, right? Like for example, Riot like explicitly saying that this is like this is what you're gonna get fined, kind of sets the upper bound for like other infractions that is gonna come up in the future.
You're talking about the 25K per player.
Yeah. So hopefully there's a process that kind of Riot and the owners go through to kind of consider future cases like this, and they're kind of more involved in how the process takes place. And then in terms of the other bit, I think doing an action like this, where you kind of like break the rules or tweak the rules, I think it's sets a really bad precedence for the league in general, because every organization tries to do everything they can to kind of follow the rules, be above board, make sure that the players and everyone's taken care of. And so something like this kind of really hurts like the image of the league, and I think that's I think the bigger problem than like the fine and what ended up happening.
Every time around this year, it feels like we have a turnover. I know last year we didn't, but we have 2 new teams entering the league, and we also even kind of have like the branding change for Clutch and Dig as that ownership group got bigger. What do you think of the new teams entering the league? And it's kind of I guess I'm curious what your take is on it, especially since it's been 2 years since the franchising stuff.
Sure. So I will say I can't really comment too much on like the turnover aspect itself, but I do think it's a really good thing for brands and teams like EG and Immortals to come back to the scene. Immortals was like a fan favorite before kind of franchising, and it's exciting to see what they're going to put together now. And EG is as an organization has been around forever, and I know they're putting a lot of effort in terms of the roster, their branding, and everything. So it's refreshing to see teams come back into the scene that we've kind of known from before, and with like more of a capital injection to see like what they're going to do in this new era.
All right, so wrapping up the interview, I also know that there's a boot camp coming up for the team. Can you give any light into or shed any light into what that system is going to look like?
Sure. So I mean, obviously we're going to have a lot of new players this year, so we just kind of wanted to boot camp somewhere away from Los Angeles to get them all together, playing solo queue, playing some scrims, getting to know each other before the season started, because usually the turnaround time for like visas and everything sometimes delays when players can come in January. So we just wanted to do something in Korea, China, or Europe. Those were the 3 regions we were looking at. Once Riot announced that Worlds is in China next year, and it's going to be like in Shanghai, I think it's the Worlds Finals. And also we have a lot of people on our staff, and even certain players have ties to China. We thought that there would be like a good opportunity for us to kind of go and boot camp there. One of the teams that we'll announce soon is actually going to be hosting us, and we're going to do some collaborations with other LPL teams while we're there. So it should be like a good, unique experience, because generally most teams go to Korea. So we just wanted to do China for this offseason.
Nice. Are you going over?
I will be there for a week or so before I have to come back here and set everything up for the next year.
Gotcha. All right. Well, I don't know if this is your camera. If there's anything you want to say to any of the TSM fans out there who are excited, nervous, anticipating anything for the 2020 season with the roster?
The only thing I'll say to TSM fans is thank you for supporting us through our ups and downs. I know that there's a lot of you guys out there. You guys message us, our staff, and our players constantly. And you guys are probably the most passionate fan base that I've ever seen, even if you aren't our fan. So the one thing I will promise you next year is that it won't be boring.
Very good. Well, I'm excited. I'm excited for an exciting TSM 2020.
Yeah.
Sounds like you are too. Thank you so much for coming into the TGI studios to sit down with me today. For everyone else, you can check out the rest of my coverage of all things off-season right here on my YouTube channel. Thanks so much for watching that video. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed producing it. I also want to show you this new Alienware Aurora Pc. It's their new desktop. It looks awesome. It's their new Legend design. There's a little thing over there. I'm going to read it, but we're going to pretend I'm not reading it, and I'm just saying this off the top of my mind. It improves airflow and reduces CPU temperature without requiring faster fan speeds or updated cooling technology. Isn't that sick? Also, it's got high capacity now with HyperX Fury DDR4 XMP memory, as well as various solid-state drive options that leave no bottlenecks along the way.
This is just off the top of my mind. These are the opinions that I have on this. They're also facts. Anyway, go check it out. Alienware.com/Travis. You'll be glad you did.